Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second day of the EvoLang conference. My name's Molly Flaherty. I'm a member of the EvoLang Scientific Committee, and I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. It's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Karen Emmorey. She is Distinguished Professor of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences at San Diego State University. She studies sign language production and comprehension, both behaviorally and in terms of representations in the brain. And additionally, she studies the impact of sign language use and exposure on non-linguistic cognition. In her work, she takes seriously concerns and methods from linguistics, education, psychology, and neuroscience, and she makes a substantial contribution to all of these fields. She's written 4 books and over 100 journal articles, and she has current grant funding from the US National Institutes of Health as well as the National Science Foundation. So here at EvoLang, iconicity is a central question for many of us, and some people in this room even propose that it's how referential communication got off the ground in the first place. And Karen Emmorey's been thinking deeply about iconicity for a long time. So,
oops.
I put my notes on the floor. Sorry. Today, Karen Emmorey is going to talk to us about the role of iconicity in sign languages. And I want to point out that her questions about iconicity are always carefully constructed. She has no illusions that iconicity is a monolith. She is very aware that one must carefully operationalize iconicity in order to ask testable questions. Sometimes iconicity might help participants in a certain task, sometimes it might hurt them, and sometimes it might not matter at all. And I promise you she'll keep you honest if you ever happen to drift towards saying something along the lines of, languages become less iconic as they mature. Not that that's ever happened to me. So I'm sure we're all anxious to learn more about her insightful, cutting-edge work. So please join me now in welcoming Karen Emmorey.
Thank you, thank you. Great. So as Molly said, a lot of theories about the language of evolution assume that the earliest manual or vocal communications were motivated or iconic in some way. And there's certainly lots of discussions about iconicity at this conference. And so what I'm going to tell you about is some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing to try to understand iconicity in sign language. In particular, we've been looking at American Sign Language. And I want to start by giving you a framework for how I kind of conceptualize iconicity. So it's based on a model proposed by Sarah Taub many years ago, the analog building model of linguistic iconicity. And the idea here is that different sign languages may select different images to schematize to represent the iconic mapping between sort of a concept and the form. So here in this example, we have ASL, the ASL sign for bird, the sign from Turkish Sign Language for bird, and you can see that both languages have selected different images to then schematize onto the phonological units of their language to encode iconicity. Now, Taub didn't propose this as a processing model. It was really just a model of linguistic description. But I think that this model fits really nicely with a proposed cognitive model, and that's the structure mapping theory of Dedra Gentner and her colleagues, where she proposes that in comparisons like analogies or metaphors, there's a structural mapping between 2 mental representations, and those mappings are structure preserving, relations mapped relations, there's one-to-one correspondence. So there's a whole theory about how this structure mapping works. And what I'd like to propose is that you can think of iconicity as a type of comparison, where you're mapping a mental representation of the form, the phonology of a linguistic unit, and the mental representation of the referent. In particular, what I want to not say is that there's a relationship between the form of the language and experience, or the world, right? That it's not a representation between the form and experience, but between 2 mental representations, okay? So with this kind of background as the format for thinking about iconicity, I'm going to ask 4 questions today, and hoping I'm not being too ambitious. One is simply, how are iconic signs distributed across the ASL lexicon? Does knowledge of the linguistic system alter the perceived iconicity of signs? So comparing deaf signers to hearing non-signers in their perception of iconicity. looking at how transparency, that is guessability, how transparent is a sign, differ from iconicity, where you know what the meaning is and you're looking at the nature of the mapping between form and meaning. And then finally, what's the brain's response to iconic signs? I'm telling you about some very new work looking at ERPs to iconic signs or iconicity. So let's start with this first question about iconicity in an established sign language that's been around for 200 or so years. And to look at this question, I want to advertise a little bit about the ASLX database. How many have heard of this database? How many have never heard of this database? Okay, good. Go to that website right there. So what this is a database that Zed Sevicovic here in my lab, Naomi Caselli and Ari Cohen-Goldberg have put together. It's a publicly available database. We have almost 1,000 signs. When you go into the database, you can type in the English gloss, and if it's in the database, the video will come up. In addition, a whole bunch of information that goes along with that sign will also be available. So we have subjective frequency ratings. So all of these signs have been rated by between 25 and 30 deaf signers for how frequent they feel the sign is from 1 to 7. We also have iconicity ratings, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, from hearing non-signers rating the iconicity of signs, again, on a scale from 1 to 7. We have information about lexical class, about compounding, and also about phonological form. So Naomi Caselli in particular has, and her team has coded signs for their hand-shape properties, location properties, movement properties. And what's also really cool is we have this beautiful visualization which shows the phonological neighborhoods. So these are networks that are connected by form. So these signs all have some form mapping in common. The nodes are the frequency, so the smaller the node, the less frequent the sign, the larger the node, the more frequent. So we've used this database in all of the studies that I'm going to be telling you about today to look at iconicity. So first, just looking at the distribution of iconicity. So this is the ratings here and then the number of signs across this lexicon. And so this is about 1,000 signs, I should say. This is ASL Lex 1.0. We're working on ASL Lex 2.0, where we're going to add another 1,500 signs to this database. And so we'll see whether this distribution changes or not. My own gut feeling is no. If anything, it's going to be even more skewed towards the low end of iconicity, but we'll see. So in creating ASL Lex, we didn't select for iconicity. In particular, when we sent out our surveys for ratings, we were more concerned about getting accurate frequency data, so that they were designed to have a normal distribution for frequency, but we didn't do anything for iconicity. So this is, you can think of it as just kind of a random selection of signs. And what you see is they tend to be rated as low iconic. Okay. We also looked at correlations between iconicity and other variables. So and our correlations are done with z-scores to get rid of variation within how different people use this scale. And you can see that more iconic signs tended to be less frequent. It's not a huge correlation, but it's significant. And so one hypothesis for why we might see this type of correlation is that as signs are used more frequently, you have changes to the iconicity, and iconicity can get reduced through production forces. So things like co-articulation, assimilation, two-handed signs become one-handed signs over time. You have phonological assimilation. So the famous example of the compound home, which was eat, sleep, becomes home. So you have phonological assimilation. So all of those kind of pressures tend to happen with more frequent signs, thus creating this possible reason for why you see less iconic signs as more tend to be less frequent, because the iconicity gets reduced with frequency. We also saw a correlation between iconicity and phonological density. So I guess this is, of course, sign-based phonological density. And what I've shown is that more iconic, or what we found is that more iconic signs tend to belong to denser phonological neighborhoods. So I've given you kind of two examples. On the left there is a sparse phonological neighborhood made up with signs that have this hand shape, so medicine, shiny, okay? Those are not iconic. I've circled in green the iconic signs here in this denser phonological neighborhood, so things like car, dice, baseball, okay? So what this suggests is that iconic signs might be constructed out of more typical unmarked sublexical properties, so unmarked locations, hand shapes. Now this is different from what's been found for sound symbolism and idiophones in spoken languages. They tend to come from sparser neighborhoods. They have more skewed phonotactics. They're sort of marked phonologically. So that type of iconicity in spoken language differs from what we see in sign languages with respect to the relationship between phonological density and iconicity. Okay, so how are iconic signs distributed across the ASL lexicon? We see iconicity is skewed toward the low end within this very large lexicon. More iconic signs tend to be less frequent and belong to denser phonological neighborhoods. Okay, so now I want to turn to my other question, which is, does knowledge of the linguistic system alter how you perceive the iconicity, whether something is more iconic or not? So we did this by comparing the hearing non-signers. This is basically the data from ASL Lex, where we had MTurk workers rate each sign. They were given the English translation of the sign and asked to rate how much does this look like what it means. The deaf signers were asked to do basically the same thing, but they weren't given, of course, the English gloss. They knew what the sign meant. And they were asked to do the same thing, rate on a scale of 1 to 7. How much does this sign look like what it means? So the first thing we found surprised me. I actually did not predict this, which was that the signers overall rated the iconicity of forms as less iconic than the hearing non-signers. Not by a lot, but it was definitely a significant difference overall. Now, I had actually thought that signers might rate things as more iconic than non-signers because they have a lot of folk knowledge about the origins and the iconicity of signs that hearing people don't, or non-signers don't have access to. So this is just one example of the sign girl, which is sort of thought to represent tracing the strap of a bonnet on the chin. Okay. Other kinds of things are this sign for argue, if you know the etymology, comes from sword fighting, right? There's lots of this that kind of information that a signer might know that a hearing non-signer doesn't know. But in fact, that's not boosting their perceived iconicity. What we think might be happening is that what's happening for signers is that they know that there's a phonology in a sense, that not all sign features have to be mapped to meaning, that they're just part of the phonology. So signs have to have a movement to be well formed. Okay? For non-signers, they have none of that kind of form-based knowledge, and so they may be trying to extract meaning from every part of the sign, from the movement, from the location, from the hand shape. Where signers may not be doing that because they know that, oh, it's just made at that location, that's part of the phonology, it's just specified for that location or that movement, for example. But if we can look at the ratings, what the deaf and hearing people are doing, and they're highly correlated. So it's not like, you know, deaf signers and hearing non-signers are doing something completely different. So they're doing the same kind of judgment, I would say, about the mapping between form and meaning. And I could just give you some examples from the high end, where so everyone agrees that drink and eyes are highly iconic. And if we look at the low end here, where both the deaf and the hearing groups consider potato low iconic. Now this again has this folk etymology of sticking a fork in a potato when it's done. It doesn't increase the iconicity for the deaf guys. There's another one, chance. Okay. But I think what's a little bit more interesting is looking at the quadrants where there's some differences between what the signers perceive and what the non-signers perceive. So here are examples where the hearing non-signers rated these signs as particularly high in iconicity, whereas the deaf signers rated them lower in iconicity. So what might be going on here? Well, what we did was we looked at signs where the hand mapped to the hand, or handling gestures. And this is where we found specifically a difference with the hearing non-signers rating these as more iconic than the deaf. So binoculars would be one example, drop is another one. And what we think is going on here is an influence of gesture, actually. So there's some recent work suggesting that when individuals have to gesture silently and indicate objects, they tend to use handling pantomimes. And those handling pantomimes tend to be better understood than other types of pantomimes in referring to objects. So it's possible that for gesture, this is an effect of gesture knowledge by the hearing non-signers, that these types of mappings where the hand maps to the hand, or the body maps to the body, is perceived as more iconic than for the deaf signers, where these are phonologically specified hand shapes, for example. Again, it's not a huge difference. They're both rating these as pretty iconic, but you get this boost maybe from gesture experience for the non-signers. And if we look at the other domain, where we see examples where the deaf signers are rating things as higher than the hearing non-signers. And this is bucking the trend, right? Because remember, overall, there's a slight tendency for deaf signers to rate things as less iconic compared to the non-signers. Here we're seeing the opposite, where they're rating these relatively high, and the non-signers are rating these relatively low. So airplane and boat. Now what you might notice about these examples is that now the hand is mapping to the object. So when we looked at whether the hand was representing either the whole entity, as in hairdryer or airplane or boat in the other examples, or part of the object, like bird, we see that the signers are rating these as more iconic. And what we think might be going on here is an effect of their knowledge of ASL, of the ASL system. So in ASL, there's something called the, I'll put in quotes, classifier system, in which the hand shape is a morpheme that represents a type of object, like a vehicle or a long, thin object, right? And signers know that about the system. And so they may be more sensitive to this hand as object type of iconicity, and therefore rate these or perceive these as more iconic than the non-signers. So, I mean, another example I like is garage, okay, which I think to a non-signer looks pretty weird, but for a signer, you just kind of know this means a vehicle, and then you have a shelter for a vehicle. Okay. One other thing we found was that if we looked just across the lexicon, we compared ratings for nouns and verbs, we found this interesting difference where the hearing non-signers would rate verbs as more iconic, but there was no difference between the groups for nouns. And this kind of makes sense with for the deaf signers, so it's more likely that you're going to have hand as object for nouns than for verbs, and so that's boosting their iconicity perception. It also fits with a study that Jenny Pyers and I have done, where we asked signers, we asked non-signers, hearing people who don't know sign, to guess whether a particular sign is a noun or a verb. And so we would show them something like this, which is the ASL noun that means scissors, okay? And you had to pick, okay, which picture does it go with? They just often were much more likely to pick the verb picture, and they were also more likely to pick the verb picture when I showed them the verb sign. So this is the verb, this is the noun, okay? So there was this bias to just interpret signs as actions. Whereas for the signers, they know that there's this difference between movement that indicates whether something is more noun-like or is a noun or a verb. But for non-signers, movement is just treated like action. So you have a mapping of movement to action, and you get this verb bias that signers don't exhibit. Okay. So does knowledge of the linguistic system alter perceived iconicity? Yes. We see that overall signers rate signs as less iconic. Non-signers rate hand as hand mappings and verbs as more iconic than signers do. And signers rate hand as object mappings as more iconic than non-signers. So now let me turn to the third question, which is thinking about how transparency and iconicity might be different. And I think this is kind of important because we often sometimes use these terms interchangeably, transparency and iconicity. But I think there are different phenomena that need to be thought about differently. So I've told you about how we get iconicity information from these ratings. We also conducted what we're calling a transparency study. So we had hearing non-signers, and we showed them a subset of the signs in ASLX, so a large subset, about 430 signs. And they were asked to just guess what this sign means. And they were asked to use really just one word if you can. So we didn't want long descriptions of what it was, just a lexicalized translation, if you will, of what this sign is. And then we asked them, okay, after they've done that, how confident or how obvious is your guessed meaning do you think it would be to other people? So this is what we're calling transparency ratings. That is, you've guessed a meaning. Do you think this is obvious to other people, or are you really just guessing? I don't think it's very transparent. I've made this guess, but other people may not guess that. Whereas, yes, I think most people are going to guess this is what it means. Okay? So here's what we found. First, this is actually not surprising for those of you who know very old research looking at transparency. Only 3% of signs, so 14 out of 430, were guessed correctly by at least 70% of the participants. Okay? And you can turn that around and look at it with respect to participants, so an average of 10% of participants' guesses were correct. So this is pretty low and replicates what other people, Kleeman Belugi in the 70s, found. But I challenge actually Marcus Perlman, if he's here, to do this study in spoken language and see what happens. Do you get even, I mean, any out of 430 translations of these signs are randomly selected English words or spoken language words. So even though this is low, it may be higher than what you find in spoken languages. But again, that's an empirical question that I think is worth asking. So this is just to give you some examples of signs that were guessed correctly by pretty much everybody. So cry, for, drink. Okay. So what's interesting about this study is we can look at then kind of mismatches. So these were signs that were rated when you knew the meaning as highly iconic. So it had a rating of above 5. But they were never or rarely guessed in our transparency study. So one is the sign for lipstick, which looks like this. So very iconic, but that's not, people did not guess lipstick. They guessed things like quiet or don't talk. My is another one. If you know the meaning, it's very iconic. A few people guessed my or me. Most people guessed, or there were several guesses that were like chest or heart. And we found this as a kind of trend throughout the data, although we're still looking at this data, that if there's something that really highlights a location, non-signers tend to guess that as meaning the location. So if it's near the eyes, any sign like the ASL sign strict, guesses that have to do with the eyes. Here's another one, fight. If you know the meaning, highly iconic, looks like this. But the guess is often something like cross or closed, rarely fight. But these two ways of looking at iconicity are not unrelated, they're correlated. So we have the hearing iconicity ratings from ASLX, the transparency ratings from our study, and you can see this correlation. And I'll show you examples where we have matches. So an example where you have a high transparency rating, people thought this would be easily guessable, and a high iconicity rating. So camera is one. Camera was often guessed as camera or photo. And country is one that had a low iconicity as well as a low transparency rating. So whatever people guessed for that, they didn't think other people would guess. Again, what's interesting is these quadrants where there's these mismatches. So here's one that has a high iconicity rating, so ball. Okay? If you know the meaning, you give it a high iconicity rating. But it had a low transparency rating. So people guessed this as together, whole, meet, conversation. These were the guesses that were all over. And I was really surprised by this because this is a sign that I often give as an example of a highly iconic sign, right? Well, it's highly iconic, but it's not particularly transparent, okay? Here's examples on the other domain where you had a low iconicity rating. So if you knew the meaning, you gave it a low rating. But there was a high transparency rating. So one example is where, okay? Nobody guessed where. Can you guess what they guessed? Yes, no, right? With confidence, this is no. This is the ASL sign for lonely. Again, low iconic rating, high transparency. What do you think people guessed there? Quiet, exactly, shush. And so here there's really a clear influence of your gestural knowledge on how you're interpreting the transparency or how you're interpreting signs. So how does transparency differ from iconicity? Signs can be rated as iconic. Very few are guessable. But we still see a correlation between iconicity and transparency rating. They're not unrelated. The differences that we see suggest that gestural knowledge can influence how sign meanings are guessed. And the thing I want you guys to kind of take away is to not assume, if you're doing these experiments, that highly iconic signs are transparent. You may think they're transparent, but they may not be. And also, don't assume that if you're showing somebody a non-iconic sign, that they're not evoking or getting some meaning out of that sign. Okay. Oh, perfect. I think we're going to be just right. So my last question is, what's the brain's response to iconic signs? And we're going to use ERPs to look at this question. And the ERP component that I'm going to be looking at is called the N400. How many people have heard of the N400? Oh, good. How many people have never heard of the N400, have no idea what I'm talking about? A few people, okay. For you guys, so we're measuring the electrical activity of the brain. It's a negative going waveform that starts about 400 milliseconds after stimulus onset. You see it to meaningful stimuli, like pictures and also words. For ERPers, they plot negative up, so I'm going to follow their tradition, even though it's really weird. We're going to plot negative. It's very non-iconic, right? What you see is that the size of this N400 effect is modulated by how much kind of processing that you need to do. So in the classic N400, you compare unrelated versus related pairs or sentences. And for the unrelated, you see a larger N400. So here, bread socks, larger N400 compared to bread butter, okay? You see a larger N400 to low versus high frequency words. You see a higher, more negative N400 to concrete compared to abstract words. Here the idea is concrete words have more elaborate, richer semantics that you're activating when you see concrete words, or you hear concrete words. And so our first question was, are signs processed the same way as words in the brain? Do we see these same kind of N400 modulations? And for time, I'm not going to show you the frequency results, but I'm going to show you the concreteness results, so comparing concrete signs versus less concrete or abstract signs, to see, do we see the same kind of modulation? And then, of course, we can ask this interesting question for sign language. Do we see a modulation of the N400 for iconic compared to non-iconic signs? So here's our paradigm. We had a large group of signers, so 40 signers, both native and early signers. And they were asked, they saw a large number of signs, so 400 signs. These, again, were all from ASL Lex. And they were asked to press a button when you see a sign that refers to a person. Okay, so doctor, nurse, boy, girl. Okay, we didn't analyze those, but they ensured that our subjects were processing these for meaning, because you had to do a semantic processing in order to make that decision. But our neural responses were not confounded by an actual overt response. So I'll show you what these look like. So here would be a concrete sign, a low concreteness sign, and then this is an example of a target sign. Now what's critical is in this study we use linear mixed effects models, regression models, and we had single trial EEG go into it. So we had both data from subjects and items. So we took care of the variation of both. But what's critical for our purposes is that we were able to control for other variables. So when we're looking at concreteness, we can control for the effects of frequency and iconicity, so we're just looking at the effects of concreteness. And when we look at iconicity, we're controlling for the effects of concreteness, because iconic signs tend to be more concrete than non-iconic signs. But when we're looking at that, we're controlling for the concreteness effect and the frequency effect. Okay. Oh, and one other thing. For the LME analyses, when I show you the voltage map, which tells you where on the scalp the effect is coming from, I'm actually going to show you the LME estimates per electrode, which is akin to the voltage map, but it's based on the significance of the LME analyses. That's just, and then the ERPs will be difference waveforms. So that's for the ERP people in the audience. All right. So first, let's see what the concreteness effect looks like for spoken word. So this is a large study by Kurt Winsler and my colleague Phil Holcomb, where they presented something like 1,000 spoken words, had 50 English speakers, and did this LME analysis. And here's the effect you see for concreteness, which is what you would expect. So this is speech, so you're hearing this. This is where the word onset is. And you see this more negative response for concrete words compared to low concrete words. And the distribution is what you'd expect with this is kind of central posterior effect is where the neural generator is for this concreteness effect. And so it's interpreted as a lexical semantic effect as you're accessing concrete words compared to less concrete words. Okay. So what do we find for sign? Well, the waveform looks different, of course, because this is, you're responding to a visual dynamic stimulus as opposed to an auditory dynamic stimulus. We time-locked ERPs to the video onset, so here, but the average sign onset is about 500 milliseconds in. So for speech, the word onset and the stimulus onset are basically the same. Your vocal cords start vibrating, that's the start of the stimulus. For sign, I have this large articulators, I have this transition period as I move to sign onset, so to get to onion, for example. So this is about where the beginning of the sign is. And you start a little bit later seeing this concreteness effect. So again, the polarity is the same. So you have more negative for high concrete words, the idea, actually this should say signs. And you see the same kind of distribution, right? So we're seeing that signers are processing concrete signs the same way speakers process concrete words, where you have this kind of more elaborate, more negative processing. All right, so what happens when we look at iconicity with the same kind of analysis? Just to give you examples, so this is from the same set, but now we're kind of sorting based on iconicity. Here would be a high iconic, low iconic, and again the same target. And the key here is that with the LME analysis, we control for concreteness. And here's what we see, nothing. So these lines are pretty much right on top of each other, we are not seeing a general effect of iconicity in the lexicon. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of neural response in any of these time windows, no difference across the scalp, that's kind of tracking iconicity or variations in lexical iconicity in the same way you see the brain tracking or responding differently to concrete and abstract words. Now, as Molly said in her introduction, iconicity is not monolithic. These analyses that I've been showing you up to now have really treated it that way, in a sense. So, but this is telling us something, that's mapping with our sense that iconicity is not monolithic. So more research is needed to sort of, okay, let's pull out different types of mappings. And do we see differences then? If we pull out different tasks, so this is basically, it's not passive viewing, you have to understand the meaning of the signs, but I'm not asking you to make any judgments about the signs. If you have the different tasks, does that change whether the brain is sensitive? And so I actually do have some good news. This is or for people who want an iconicity effect. This is hot off the presses. We've been looking at sign production. So I've just showed you comprehension. This is production. This is a picture naming task. So you're asked to just name a picture. And half of the pictures were named with highly iconic signs, and half were named with non-iconic signs. And these were matched for frequency, for concreteness. They're all concrete, they're all picturable, as well as matched for phonological variables like how many handedness and hand-shaped markedness. ERPs were time-locked to picture onset. The way we record response time for sign is from key release. We've done this a number of times in picture naming studies. So picture comes on, you're holding down the space bar or a key. As soon as you know what the sign is, you lift the key, you produce the sign. We throw out trials where you hesitate, and that gets us our RTs for picture naming. So we have 23 ASL signers, either native or early exposed signers. And here's examples of what the picture stimuli look like. So we have the iconic sign drum. So you can kind of notice the mapping between the sign and the object. Scissors. And here are examples of non-iconic signs, so frog, shoes. Okay. So here's what we see. So again, time-locked to picture onset. Okay. And what we see is in this 400 milliseconds after stimulus input, we see an effect of iconicity. So producing iconic signs elicits a more negative response than the non-iconic signs. And we're interpreting this effect, and this is before you start signing. So the average initiation that is lifting that space bar was about 800 milliseconds. Interestingly enough, we did not see an RT difference between naming iconic and non-iconic pictures. Others in the field have found differences, but in this study, there were just no differences in RT. But the brain made a difference. This is why ERPs are cool. So we're interpreting this as something that's akin to concreteness. It's not the same thing, but we're using the same kind of idea that you have a little bit more elaborate processing for the iconic signs. There's more features that match to the picture that you have to name compared to non-iconic signs. And that may be giving rise to this more negative response for iconic signs. Now, the distribution is not like concreteness. The distribution is a more anterior distribution. So this is where the neural generator may be different. And what we think is going on here is it has something to do with the sign form, either the visual overlap between the form and the picture, or just something about accessing the form in the sign. And this is because we have two studies that are now out looking at form priming in ASL. So one study looks at implicit priming, where you actually never see the sign, you see the English words, but their translations are related in ASL by form. Or we present the actual signs and we're looking at sign priming. Signs that are related in phonology like movie and school. Okay? And what you get is a priming effect that's larger when you compare the related to an unrelated prime target pair. And the distribution in both those studies was more anterior. And so we think that this anterior response is something about the actual form of the signs. Because of course you have a very different visual form, different articulators, so you may have a different generator for form. Okay. So what's the brain response to iconic signs? We don't see this kind of neural signature that tracks with the iconicity of signs and comprehension. Retrieval of iconic signs in response to pictures elicits increased negativity, suggesting more elaborate processing. And I think this actually has to do also with the picture naming task. That needs more research to see if that's true, but I think there's something, again, this comes kind of my framework, something about matching the visual overlap or perceptual overlap between pictures and the iconic form that might be giving rise to this. But that we need more work. So for example, an easy study to do would be just the English translation. You have to translate it versus name it with a picture. If I'm correct, we should not see an iconicity effect in that domain. So there's lots of work to do. Like I said, this is really, we just got these results like last week. Okay, so my take-home messages. Iconic forms are not evenly distributed across the ASL lexicon, so something changes over time with an established lexicon. Both linguistic knowledge and gestural experience seem to impact how iconicity is perceived. Transparency and iconicity are distinct phenomenon. And there doesn't seem to be a general effect of neural effect of iconicity for sign recognition. Again, it's probably not this monolithic thing. But we do see an impact of iconicity on the neural response during lexical retrieval during production. Okay, we're good. So I want to end by acknowledging the ASL Lex team. So Zed, Naomi, and Ari, it's really a team effort in working on ASL Lex, and stay tuned for ASL Lex 2.0, which is also going to have more elaborate phonological coding for the linguists in the audience. The ERP team, so Phil and Kathy, their lab is right across the parking lot from our lab. It's been a great collaboration. Kurt Winsler is the LME expert, and Megan McGarry is the person who did the production study. She's a new graduate student with us. And of course, I have to thank Cindy Farnaday. She's our deaf research scientist who has worked on all of these. You will recognize her face. She's now becoming very famous because of ASL Lex, and she's just been a wonderful colleague to work with. And then I want to thank all of the deaf and hearing people who participated in our studies. Without people volunteering to be a subject in our studies, the work is simply not possible. And of course, the funding agencies. So I think I have time for questions. So